Imagine for a second that the physical world around you, the concrete beneath your feet, the events unfolding in your day-to-day life, even the grand narrative of history itself, imagine it isn't quite as solid as it appears. Welcome to this explainer on a staggering concept known as the Conscious Singularity Hypothesis. Today, we're going to totally reframe your understanding of cause, effect, and your own personal agency. Our goal here is to figure out how the absolute tiniest actions you take might not just be pushing physical dominoes around, but actively constructing the very reality you experience.
Okay, so we've all heard of the butterfly effect, right? Back in 1963, a meteorologist named Edward Lorenz proposed this famous idea. A fragile butterfly flaps its wings in the jungles of Brazil, and that tiny shift in air pressure sets off a massive, devastating tornado in Texas weeks later. Pop culture absolutely loves this concept, but classically, that wing flap is always treated as a blind, random accident. It's just another rigid gear turning in this mechanical clockwork universe. But what happens if we actually challenge that baseline? Like, what happens if that wing flap isn't a mechanical accident at all, but an observer's conscious decision?
To figure that out, we need to look at our first section, clockwork versus quantum reality. Notice the stark contrast between these two frameworks. In classical Newtonian physics, the universe is entirely deterministic. Think of it like a giant, perfectly rigged game of dominoes. If you somehow knew the exact position and momentum of every single atom in the universe, which we call the fixed initial conditions, the entire future would be perfectly predictable. But subatomic physics completely shatters that comforting clockwork model. At the fundamental level, those initial conditions literally do not exist as fixed physical facts until an observation actually occurs. Before a measurement is made, particles exist in a state of quantum superposition. They aren't in one specific place. They exist as a fluid cloud of infinite, simultaneous probabilities. So this leaves us with a pretty massive paradox. If classical chaos theory proves that initial conditions dictate the entire future, but quantum mechanics proves that initial conditions don't even exist until they're measured, what exactly is setting the initial conditions of reality? Well, the answer is you. Prior to measurement, the universe is just raw potential. It's the observer who actively sets the initial conditions. And that realization brings us right to the threshold of human experience. Let's move on to microselections. Every single day, you make thousands of these without even realizing it. Taking a deep breath instead of reacting angrily when someone cuts you off in traffic. Choosing to look up at the sky and just be present instead of passively doom-scrolling on a screen for another hour. Pausing for 5 seconds before firing off a highly frustrated email. We normally just write these off as trivial moments of psychological management, but under the Conscious Singularity Hypothesis, these are known as microselections, and they aren't just psychology. They are literal, localized quantum measurement events. They are the exact mechanisms by which you steer reality. Try to think of human awareness as a beam of light. Imagine you're standing in a freezing, pitch-black forest. This represents the universe of pure, uncollapsed probability. In a classical, clockwork worldview, turning on your flashlight just shows you a dirt path that was already physically sitting there in the dark. But in the quantum view, your conscious attention does something so much more profound. It doesn't just reveal a pre-existing path, it actively materializes that path out of the quantum haze. Watch how this cascade effect mathematically builds. First, you exist in infinite superposition. That's a space where multiple potential choices are equally real. Then, you make a subtle internal focus shift. A microselection. That fraction of a second of conscious focus acts as a physical measurement. It locks in one solidified microfact, and at the exact same moment, it forces millions of alternative physical branches, those other potential paths in that dark forest, to simply dissolve back into potential energy. That incredibly subtle shift in your internal state acts as the ultimate initial condition, sending physical ripples outward. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This sounds incredibly philosophical. But it's time to ground this in hard science, in our next section, the physics of chaos. It is totally logical for skeptics to assume that all this microscopic quantum weirdness just smooths itself out before it reaches the macroscopic scale of our everyday lives. For decades, physicists assumed a process called classical decoherence would average out quantum uncertainties. Imagine dropping a single drop of red food coloring into the vast ocean. Eventually, it disperses so completely you can't even see it anymore. But here's the thing, we do not live in a linear ocean. We live in a highly chaotic, nonlinear world. And modern research into quantum chaos proves that under these nonlinear conditions, microscopic quantum phase shifts actually do not average out. Instead, they entangle with the environment and scale exponentially, creating massive, unavoidable impacts on the macro environment.
So, this isn't just an abstract theory. It is backed by over 60 years of undeniable physics. We can trace this from Lorenz's mathematical proof of chaos back in 1963 all the way to Wheeler's delayed choice execution in 2007 and the genuinely groundbreaking Wigner's friend experiment in 2019. Let's look closely at these recent laboratory breakthroughs just to assure you that actual, hard physics bridges the gap between human observation and physical reality. In 2007, Jean-Francois Roche and his team successfully executed John Wheeler's famous delayed choice experiment using quantum interferometers. They fired single photons through a device, basically giving the particle a literal fork in the road, 2 paths it could take. But the researchers made the choice to measure the photon's path at the very last microsecond, chronologically after the photon had already passed the fork. The result is wonderfully absurd. Making a measurement choice in the present actually dictated whether the photon behaved as a particle or a wave in the past. An observer's micro-decision essentially reached back in time and retroactively rewrote the historical probability chain of a physical system. And as if that wasn't mind-bending enough, we arrive at the 2019 Heriot-Watt University experiment testing Wigner's friend. They set up a highly complex scenario with entangled photons acting as observers. So observer Alice is inside a sealed lab, making a measurement and getting a definitively collapsed physical fact. But observer Bob, standing outside the lab, mathematically sees the entire lab, including Alice herself, as still existing in uncollapsed superposition. For decades, classical intuition told us one of them absolutely had to be wrong. But the 2019 physical data prove that both states were valid simultaneously: Alice's collapsed fact and Bob's uncollapsed superposition. 2 different observers can extract entirely different, equally valid physical facts from the exact same event. Which leads us directly to this staggering scientific conclusion. Objective reality, as some rigid, universal, shared baseline that we're all just passively standing on, simply does not exist. Facts are fundamentally observer-dependent. And if objective reality doesn't exist, what does that make your subjective experience? A conscious observation isn't a passive recording of the world. It carries massive, nonlinear structural weight across both space and time. This brings us to our final and most important human takeaway, Section 4, Steering the Cascade. Let's look at how we apply this to our lives. When we look at macro problems in our careers, the exhausting burnout in modern society, or deep, stubborn conflicts in our relationships, it is so incredibly easy to feel completely paralyzed. These issues feel like giant, immovable granite mountains. You might reasonably wonder how a tiny 5-second decision could possibly chip away at something so massively set in stone. But that feeling of emotional and physical paralysis comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of physics. We suffer from the illusion of the immovable mountain. The mountain isn't actually solid granite. Millions. The mountain, that immovable macro reality stressing you out, is simply the accumulated cascade of millions of localized micro-selection events. It's a dense cloud of entangled probability that is continuously refreshing itself based on ongoing observations. You don't change a mountain by trying to push the entire cliff face at once. You change it by recognizing what it's actually made of. So here is the empowering takeaway you should keep from all of this. First, recognize that reality is just fluid probability waiting for your direction. Second, use your brain for what it actually is, a highly precise steering system. Your brain isn't just a biological reaction engine meant to endure stress. It is a quantum reality rendering tool. And third, turn your intentional presence into an active quantum flap. You are not a passive spectator just trying to survive a chaotic, unpredictable world. Every single time you choose focus over distraction, you are locking in a timeline. You are actively steering the cascade. And that realization invites an incredibly provocative leap. If relational facts are genuinely observer-dependent, and if one individual's micro-selections can collapse reality locally, what happens when human micro-attentions actually synchronize? If an entire community, or perhaps our whole human species, points our collective awareness at the exact same probability branch at the exact same time, could that collective focus act as a unified quantum measurement? Could it theoretically alter the physical, macroscopic timeline of the planet itself? Collective intentionality might just be the physical engine of reality. You are the initial condition. The universe is constantly waiting for you to render it definite.
So, as you move through your day, making those thousands of split-second micro-selections, stop and ask yourself, what exactly are you choosing to tell the universe today? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Take a breath, turn on your flashlight, and keep steering your cascade.